I think, behaviors, this is, I think, one of the common myths about behavior change. People say, behavior change is so hard. It's so difficult to change habits, whatever. The truth is we're changing all the time. One of the primary functions of your brain is to change your behavior whenever the environment shifts or whenever the context shifts. So you're very capable of change and you're kind of doing it constantly. However, in order to change in an intentional way, in order to be in control of that change and not just having it happen to you, I think you have to start with some kind of awareness. So the point that you just made about the book is actually about self-awareness. It's actually about understanding yourself better. It's actually about seeing some of the behaviors that you're usually blind to. That I feel like is an essential first step if you want to be in control of that process in any way. A lot of people feel like they're the victim of their habits, but I think if you want to become the architect of them, you need to have some kind of self-awareness. You need to be able to identify, what am I actually doing right now? What is the truth of this situation? And where do I want to go? What is the truth of what I want to become or want to achieve? And then you can start to bridge that gap once you have a better, clearer understanding of where you currently stand and where you want to go.
Is there an argument that we shouldn't use the term good and bad when it comes to habits? Now, I get it. Most of us would consider, I don't know, moving our bodies more, in inverted commas, good habits. But you describe so beautifully how all behaviors really are playing a role in our lives in some way. And in some ways, assigning good and bad to them might be, layering on a level of judgment, which can often actually get people even more stuck. So I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, you can sort of twist this either way. Like on the one hand, I do think there's an argument for just saying, listen, there aren't really good or bad habits. There are effective habits in the sense that they are effective at solving the problem that you're facing in that moment. And having some additional layer of judgment or feeling guilty about that probably isn't serving you. It's not really helping you move forward. So maybe we could dismiss that. On the other hand, I think we all sort of implicitly understand what we're saying when we say it's a good habit or a bad habit. But I have wrestled with this a little bit more because there are some academics or some researchers who kind of adamantly say that there is no such thing as a good or a bad habit. And here's where I've come down on it. Pretty much all behaviors in life produce multiple outcomes across time. So broadly speaking, let's say there's an immediate outcome and there's an ultimate outcome. And with your bad habits or things that we commonly call a bad habit, usually the immediate outcome is favorable. Like the immediate outcome of eating a donut is great. It's sweet, it's sugary, it's tasty, it's enjoyable. It's only the ultimate outcome a year or 2 years from now, or if you keep eating donuts, that's unfavorable. With a good habit or something we commonly call a good habit, like say going to the gym, the immediate outcome is often kind of unfavorable. Like the immediate outcome of going to the gym for the first week is your body looks the same in the mirror. The scale hasn't changed. If anything, you're a little bit sore. It's only the ultimate outcome, a year or 2 or 5 later that is favorable. And I think, first of all, I feel like this is an important point for a couple of reasons. First, it helps explain a little bit why we continue to repeat habits that we consider to be bad for us. The reason is because they serve you in the moment. Even something like smoking a cigarette, the immediate outcome might be that you get to socialize with friends outside the office or you curb your nicotine craving. It's only the ultimate outcome that is unfavorable. And we tend to have brains that are wired for immediate returns. And that, that makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Like you would rather have a brain that takes shelter from a storm now than one that doesn't. You would rather have a brain that prioritizes getting the next meal than giving equal weight to a meal that you might have in 2 weeks. Yeah. And so it serves us usually to be immediately focused. But in modern society, it comes back to hurt us a little bit when it comes to a lot of these bad habits. With good habits, however, it's a lot about finding ways to delay gratification or to pull the long-term rewards of those good habits into the present moment so that you feel good right now. In ancient history or in prehistory, our ancestors largely grew up in environments that were immediately focused, like I said, taking shelter from a storm or getting the next meal or something like that, avoiding predators. But modern society has become increasingly focused on delayed rewards. You go to school now so that you can graduate in a few years. You show up at work this week so that you can get a paycheck in a month. You save for retirement now so that you can have financial security a decade or 2 or 3 from now. And so modern society asks us to make more delayed return decisions than our ancestors did. And so I think we have a little bit of friction with a lot of the good habits that we want to build are more delayed than what maybe our biological underpinnings are wired for. So there's a little bit of a challenge there. But I think the summary of this is that if I were to define what is a good habit, what is a bad habit, I would say the cost of your good habits are in the present. The cost of your bad habits are in the future. And it's really that gap between immediate outcome and ultimate outcome that I think helps define what is good or bad. Your good habits are the ones that serve you in the long run. Your bad habits are the ones that don't serve you well in the long run. And that I think is a, maybe a simplistic way of viewing it, but it kind of gives us a clean division for how most of us actually use the word in conversation.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think I think the way you've come down there is really helpful, because I think sometimes we can, in science and academia, sort of get a bit lost sometimes in terms of what technically is something, how can we define it? And of course, I understand the value in that, but it also has to be translated for the layman in terms of, well, what does that mean for me?
There's value in being precise, but there's more value in being useful. And so I would rather have a useful definition than a precise one. This is maybe one example of that.
Hey, you're preaching to the converted. I'm all for things like that. It's about, you wrote a book, you come up with these concepts. You write, I've got to say, I want to talk about your newsletter at some point. It is just a brilliant newsletter. And guys,
thank you.
I would encourage anyone to sign up for it. The 3C1 newsletter. It's one that I read on most weeks. I won't say I read it every week, because I don't, but I see it every week, and I read them more than...
I'm just happy that you're showing up at all, man. I think it's great. Thank you.
No, and I actually don't know how you produce that level of content on a weekly basis. You must have some... In fact, let's go there now. You must have some pretty good habits or systems in place to produce such high quality output on a weekly basis. So I wonder if you're able to share some of them.
Thank you for saying that. Pretty much every thought we have is downstream from what we consume. And so I think the first step for me is trying to choose good pieces of information to consume. Almost all of my, reading is kind of like fuel for me. The way that I think about it is, I had this little challenge, challenging point in my career where after about a year or two, my audience had started growing, and I thought, oh, people are paying attention now. Now I need to be really good, And so I thought, well, if I just spend more time writing, then that's how I can make it even better. I'd need to put more effort in. But actually, I think it ended up making it worse, because what I didn't realize is that if I don't have good ideas to write about, I don't need to write more. I need to read more. And so it's kind of like driving a car, and reading is like filling up the tank with gas. And writing is like going on an adventure and going on a journey and getting somewhere. And the point of having a car is not to just stay at the gas station and fill it up with gas all day. Like, you're supposed to actually go somewhere. So if you only consume, that's not beneficial. But if all you do is try to drive and put stuff out, then at some point you run out of gas. And so I need a balance between the two. I get that in a couple different ways. Trying to select good books to read, of course, is a big part of that. But I've found Twitter to be really useful. I've spent what probably would be considered an unreasonable amount of time curating my Twitter feed. And I would say it might be over 100 hours at this point that I've spent looking at different profiles. Should I follow this person or not? What about people I really like? Who do they follow? And just kind of doing this endlessly, over and over again. I sort of do this kind of, it's like bulking and then cutting basically, but for Twitter. So I kind of bulk up and add 100 accounts that I'm going to follow. And then I sit with that for a couple weeks, and then I cut again and, only keep the ones that are really useful, really high signal, low noise. But the end result of that is that essentially I'm crafting my information flow, because I log in there, for an hour or two every day. And that's determining what I'm seeing in my timeline, what's popping up in my feed. And I would say at this point, every day I probably get at least 3 ideas from my Twitter feed, probably more, that I take notes on and maybe spark me to go read something more, go down a rabbit hole or something like that. So I really feel like that's probably the most important part in my process, is crafting information flows and figuring out what to read. And then the ideas sort of bubble up naturally when you're getting that much inspiration. I have more practical or tactical stuff. Like we have a big spreadsheet that I keep where I dump all of my ideas into it, and I dump any interesting quotes I have into it. And eventually those, we go back through those and I select my favorites, and those kind of make it into the newsletter. So there's sort of like an additional round of curation that goes on. But I do think reading is probably the most important part of the process.
Yeah, what's interesting about that for me, James, is we started off this conversation talking about our social environments, and we've kind of evolved it into your social media environments, which certainly is part of our social environment. The way humans now live and consume information and interact with people is done online. A lot of it's done online, a lot of it's done through social media. And I really like that idea. I've been sort of talking on my Instagram, as it happens, about this for a while to people. Say, look, you've really got to take control over who you're following. The way you're going to think, your ideas of the world, but also how you feel. Like if you're struggling with stress and anxiety, I sort of think, well, are you following people who make you feel more stressed, make you feel more anxious, whose whole persona is on calling other people out, and then therefore it's going to be a whole divisive type of feed you're following? Or do you want to spend time following, people who make you feel good, positive, compassionate, whatever it is you want? It's not for me to say what people should or shouldn't follow. I guess you found what you need from Twitter, and you've not just left it up to chance, which kind of goes to your central theme in the book as well, which is about, we're results of the habits we're following, but half the time we don't even know that these are habits that we've been actually following until we shine a light on it. And it's the same principle that you're using with Twitter, right? You're being really intentional about who you're following. But would you recommend, given how important our environment and what we surround ourselves with is, would you almost say that that is something that all of us should be considering when we go online?
Oh, I think so. When you choose the people that you follow online, you are sort of like, it's like you get to pick the citizens for your own little city. You're getting to create that, and you want to be very careful about who you let into your city, about who you're allowing to be part of that information flow, because essentially what you're choosing is you're choosing the people who are shaping your thoughts. And that's one of the most important choices that you can make. So I agree with you. I think a lot of the time behavior on social media is somewhat mindless. We follow someone because we've been following them for a long time, and we, look at their posts because we always look at their posts when we log into Instagram or Twitter or wherever. And we don't really think carefully, does this actually benefit me? Like, is this giving me good things to think about? Do I feel better about myself after I look at this? I had one friend who, she told me, she was like, I just deleted Instagram because I felt worse about myself after I logged in every time. And it took her a while to realize that. And I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I have an Instagram account, but I do think that you need to be careful about who you follow. So curating that is a big part of, you're not only choosing who to follow, you're choosing what your future self will think. And you want to make sure that you're giving yourself the opportunity to have good future thoughts.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen The Social Dilemma that's come out recently on Netflix.
I haven't seen it, but I know Tristan and have been familiar with his work for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's one of the most important documentaries I've seen in a long time. It definitely warranted me plugging in, waiting for the box to load for 5 minutes before I could press play on that. But it really has made me think. And, we've not spoken about identity yet. And I really want to get into that. But what was interesting about the social media algorithms and the way they were explaining it in the documentary is that they're actually changing the way that we think, and therefore changing the way that we behave. And if we really take that, put that at the forefront of our minds, if the people you follow and the algorithms, which are then tracking that and then feeding you more content, have the potential to change how you think and then how you behave, well, what could be more important than curating your online world intentionally? one thing I was doing before, I think it makes a difference. So on Instagram, when you follow someone, you can actually go in and actually add them to a close friends list. And that's what I started doing. Maybe there's 10 or 20 people. They're not all close friends, but I've added them to close friends list because I'm like, I really like these people's content. I actually want to see their content when they post it. And that's again, it's just another practical thing that I think it helps people take control a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. It's choosing information flows, social media being probably one of the primary ones for all of us, is a huge, crucial thing for kind of shaping your future thoughts.
Now, Jason, but you've got these 4 laws, these 4 laws of change, of behavior change, I guess. And I wonder if we could go through them. I guess we've touched on a couple of them in sort of passing so far. But before we start that, I wonder if you could define what a habit is, what an atomic habit is, and then we can maybe sort of expand upon these 4 laws.
So there are a couple different definitions of a habit. You know, the one that's most common or is something to the effect of a habit is a behavior that you've repeated enough times to be more or less automatic, or, you know, it's something fairly mindless, automatic, routine behavior. So brushing your teeth, tying your shoes, unplugging the toaster after each use. Like, you just kind of do these things automatically. They take 30 seconds or a minute, or, you know, they're pretty quick. There are some other ways to define a habit, though, and I like to use some of these alternate definitions because I think it helps reveal a little bit more nuance about what habits are and where they live in our lives. So, for example, another way to define a habit is it's a behavior that is repeated in a particular context. So you start to realize that the environment matters a lot in habits. Like, your couch at 7 p.m. might be where you watch Netflix. And so it's actually the behavior of watching Netflix is tied to that context. If you're somewhere else at 7 p.m., then you probably won't perform that same habit. And so you start to realize how much your behavior is linked to the environment or the circumstance around you. A third definition of a habit, which I really like, Jason Rea, who's a behavioral scientist, he has something where he says something to the effect of habits are solutions to recurring problems in your environment. And what I like about that is it speaks to habits serve a purpose. They are effective at solving some kind of problem. And if you start to unpack that a little bit more, you see that there can be quite a variety in the habits that people build. For example, you finish the workday and it's like 6 p.m. and you're exhausted and tired from a long day of work. Well, in a sense, that's a problem that your brain needs to solve. And one person might solve that problem by playing video games for an hour. And another person might solve it by smoking a cigarette. And a third person might solve it by going for a run. And you can see pretty quickly that there are some solutions that are more effective or optimal or healthy than others. And I think the question to ask yourself, you know, early on when you're a child, you inherit these solutions. You kind of inherit, you soak up the habits that you see role modeled by your parents or your friends or whatever experiences that you happen to have in your narrow sliver of the universe. But what are the odds that the habits that you inherited from your childhood, the experiences you had and the things that you saw done, are also the optimal solution to the problems that you face?
Yeah.
It's very unlikely that whatever you happen to stumble across is actually the optimal way to do it. And if you realize that, then you come to discover that as you become an adult and you're more in control of your habits and your environment, it becomes your responsibility to assess what are the problems and challenges I face repeatedly, the things that I'm trying to solve, and what would be a better way to do that? What are the optimal solutions? So it's not your fault if you inherited unhelpful habits or unproductive habits, but it is your responsibility to try to figure out how to adjust those and how to improve those in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
All right. So that's kind of my long definition of what is a habit. Now, what is an atomic habit? I use the phrase atomic because I think it has 3 meanings and all 3 kind of apply to building better habits. So the first meaning of the word atomic is tiny or small, like an atom. And that is part of my philosophy. Habits should be small and easy to do and not very difficult and convenient. The second meaning of the word atomic is the fundamental unit in a larger system. So atoms build into molecules, molecules build into compounds, and so on. And we mentioned this earlier, but your habits are kind of like the fundamental unit of the overall system that you run. Each one's like a little gear in the overall machine. And collectively, you put all those little units together and you end up with your daily routine or your lifestyle. And then the third and final meaning of the word atomic is the source of immense energy or power. And I think that if you combine all three of those meanings, you make changes that are small and easy to do, and you layer them together like units in a larger system, you can end up with some really powerful results. And those three kind of different meanings of atomic, I think if you apply those to building better habits, you can end up with a really powerful system of better habits and behaviors. And so that's kind of where the phrase atomic habit came from and how I feel or think about using it in that context.
Yeah. Wow. No, thanks for that. Really useful way to think about habits. So trying to think about habits through the lens of health, let's say, meditation is a habit. So I should say meditation is a practice that many people struggle to do consistently. Many people have the desired outcome of, I want to meditate, I want to be a meditator. I read about all these benefits, but I just can't do it. And I wonder if it might be useful to try and unpick why it's difficult, but through the lens of those 4 laws. I wonder if you'd be game for that, to see if we can maybe to make it super practical for people.
Yeah, sure, of course. Let me just give a summary of the 4 laws first, and then we can kind of dive into using that example. So if you want to have it stick, you kind of roughly have 4 different things that if you can get them working for you, they're sort of like levers. And if they're in the right positions, building good habits is easier. And if they're in the wrong positions, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle. So the first thing is you want to make your habits obvious. Most habits are preceded by some kind of cue. And so you want the cues of your habits to be obvious, available, visible, easy to see. The easier it is to see or get your attention, the more likely you are to stick with the habit or perform it. The second one is to make your habits attractive. If you want your habits to be motivating, if you want them to be compelling, then you need it to be attractive in some form. The third law is to make it easy. So the easier, more convenient, frictionless your habits are, the more likely you are to perform them. We've talked a little bit about that with environment design already. Sure. And the fourth and final thing is you want to make it satisfying. So the more satisfying or enjoyable a habit is, the more likely you are to stick with it. Now, not every behavior in life is satisfying or rewarding, right? Sometimes things have a cost or a consequence. Sometimes they're fairly neutral. But if a behavior is not rewarding, if it's not enjoyable, at least to some degree, then it's unlikely to become a habit. It needs to have some kind of positive emotional signal associated with it that kind of tells your brain, hey, that felt good. You should repeat this again next time. So real quick summary, the 4 laws of behavior change: make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. And I think that sort of gives you a high level framework for getting a good habit to stick. I'll just kind of make a note of this right here. We don't have to get into it in detail, but I do just want to mention it, which is those 4 help you build a good habit. If you want to break a bad habit, then you just invert those 4. So rather than making it obvious, you want to make it invisible, unsubscribe from emails, or reduce exposure to the cue. Rather than making it attractive, you want to make it unattractive. Making it easy, make it difficult, increase friction, add steps. Rather than making it satisfying, make it unsatisfying, add some kind of immediate cost or consequence to the behavior. So that's like the high level view for breaking a bad habit. And obviously the book goes into many more examples of like how to do each of those, but we can talk about how to apply it to meditation now.
Yeah. So someone's listening to this or watching it on YouTube and they go, right, okay, I'm bought in, going to get James's book. I'm going to start a meditation practice. Where should I begin? How would you advise them using your sort of framework of these laws?
So usually if I say, okay, we got to start in some place, what's the first thing I should do? I actually typically recommend what I call the 2-minute rule. And the 2-minute rule is part of that third law, which is making it easy. And the 2-minute rule says take whatever habit you're trying to build and scale it down to something that takes 2 minutes or less to do. So do yoga 4 days a week becomes take out my yoga mat, or meditate for 15 minutes a day becomes meditate for 2 minutes. And sometimes I say that and people resist it a little bit because they're like, okay, I know the real goal isn't just to take my yoga mat out, right? And I know I'm actually trying to do the workout. So if this is some kind of mental trick, then like, why would I fall for it, basically? And I get where people are coming from, but so I have this reader, his name's Mitch, and he lost a bunch of weight, kept it off for over a decade. But for the first 6 weeks that he went to the gym, he had a rule for himself where he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So he'd get in the car, drive to the gym, get out, do half an exercise, get back in the car, drive home. And it sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds silly. You're like, obviously, this is not going to get the guy the results that he wants. But if you take a step back, what you realize is that he was mastering the art of showing up, right? He was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week, even if it was only for 5 minutes. And I think this is a much deeper truth about habits that often gets overlooked, which is a habit must be established before it can be improved, right? It has to become the standard in your life before you can optimize and scale it up. And for whatever reason, we get very all or nothing with our habits. You know, it's like I have to find the perfect workout program or the ideal business plan or the best diet to follow before I can take a first step. And I can imagine in this meditation example, there are probably many people who are like, well, what is the best form of meditation? Like that would be one of the first things they would ask themselves. Then they'd spend hours researching on YouTube and whatever. And, you know, a lot of the time we put off action because we think I need to learn more. But usually the best way to learn is by taking action. And so the 2-minute rule kind of helps you overcome that tendency to have this like perfectionist spiral and research too much and encourages you to just get started. So I think that's step number one is let's take meditation and let's just scale it down to something you can always do. We're just going to meditate for, say, 60 seconds. And then we can start to apply some of the other laws. So let's say we've got the first law, make it obvious. Well, there are a couple of different things that you could make meditation obvious. You could, if you're going to do it on your phone, if you're going to download one of the meditation apps like Calm or Waking Up or Headspace or something like that, you could take that app and put it on the home screen, the way that I mentioned earlier in this interview about moving Audible there. So you can make it the most obvious app on your phone. If you don't care about that, or you're just going to do it like in your house or in a room or something, you need to figure out where is that going to occur. So this is something I mentioned in the book. I think it's in chapter 5. I talk about implementation intentions. And implementation intentions are when you state your intention to implement a particular behavior at a certain time, in a certain place, on a certain day. So it's like, when do I meditate? I meditate on Mondays at 7 a.m. in my guest room or whatever. You know, like you have to have a space where that actually happens. And maybe you have a meditation pillow. So you set that up and that's all, you know, the environment, the space is primed. You know, it could be just in the corner of your living room or something, but there needs to be some space where that habit lives. And it's very clear when and where to do it. A lot of people feel like what they lack is motivation, but what they really lack is clarity. They lack a very clear understanding of when and where the habit's going to live. So honestly, I think just those two things. So that's the first law, make it obvious, deciding when and where it's going to occur. And the third law, make it easy, scaling it down and just doing it for 60 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever. Those two things alone would go a long way in getting people to stick with a new meditation habit.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, James. And I just want to share with you a patient story from, I'm going to guess 7-8 years ago. And, you know, I've often said this, but as a medical doctor, I mean, I can definitely put my hands up and say very clearly that my patients have taught me a lot more than I taught them. Because I often say this when I'm teaching doctors as well, really listen to your patients, listen to what they're telling you. They will often tell you why something's working, why it's not working. And one thing I've observed, I've been really curious as to why does the same advice work for one patient and not work for another patient? Why does one patient go with that and sort of implement it all and come back like a different person, literally a different person, not just different health, a different person, which we'll also talk about. And why does someone else really, really struggle? I remember this case, this lady who I think stress and chronic unremitting stress was driving a lot of her symptoms, her headaches, her insomnia, her mood issues. And we tried all kinds of things. And she actually wanted to meditate, but she said, she tried before, but when I sort of probed her a little bit, she said, it's just not for me, doc. I've tried it. I've tried the apps. You know, I've tried YouTube videos. It's just not for me. And when you probed, when I sort of delved a bit deeper, she'd actually made it really hard. She wanted to do 20 minutes consistently. And because she hadn't met that bar, she, in her head, is not a meditator. So I said to her, I said, hey, look, what do you think you could commit to every day? Could you do 10 minutes? She goes, no, I could try, but I don't think so. I said, okay, how about 5? She thought about it. She said, I don't know. I said, okay, how about 1 minute? She said, well, yeah, I could do 1 minute, but will it make any difference? I said, well, hold on a minute. Let's just make a commitment here, right? So and actually, it's a lot younger as a doctor back then. And I said to her, I tell you what, whatever you commit to doing, I will also do it. I write it in a diary. And when you come back to see me next week, we'll compare, right? So I added that sort of accountability piece with her. But she started off doing 1 minute. And we also defined when she was going to do it. It was going to be first thing in the morning before she did anything else. That 1 minute, after a couple of weeks became 5 minutes, not because I asked her to, but because she, as you would say, she was mastering the art of showing up. I didn't know how to articulate it. I didn't know the science of behavior change back then. I was sort of just going on intuition as a clinician. How can I help that lady do what she tells me she wants to do? And now she's meditating for 20 minutes a day, locked in, right? And so if anyone is skeptical about your 2-minute rule, I would sort of concur as a clinician that this stuff works, you just got to commit to it, right?
One of the most motivating feelings for the human mind is the feeling of progress.
Yeah.
If you're making progress, you have every reason in the world to continue. It's like, oh, we're moving forward. I'm making progress on the goal that I'm hoping to achieve. And so there's this weird trick that we can play on ourselves in our brain where we're like, well, I want to meditate for 20 minutes. And if she would have done it for 1 minute, she would have felt like a failure if that was her expectation, right? But somehow, just by shifting it and saying, no, I'm only going to try to do this for 1 minute. If she does it for 2 minutes, she feels like she crushed it, And so it's this very strange thing. And I think that's a good argument for, especially in the beginning, starting with keeping the bar low, and you need to get in your reps. And this is true, I think, for almost any kind of habit that you're building. Like, you need the repetitions, whether it's meditating for 1 minute or writing 1 sentence or reading 1 page. It doesn't matter that it's almost always better to do less than you had hoped than to do nothing at all. And the 2-minute rule kind of helps nudge you toward that direction, nudge you toward the direction of getting in your reps, getting it done, and mastering the art of showing up, even if it's in a small way, and then using that as a foothold to advance to the next level and kind of build some momentum and get that feeling of progress.
Yeah. Now you sort of frame that with 2 of the 4 laws. I really like the 4th law, make it satisfying. What are some of the ways that people can make things satisfying? As you were talking about before, how can you, often the problem is with good habits, or, in inverted commas, good habits, the problem often is the desired effect is somewhere in the future.
Right.
So how can people bring that into the present?
Well, I think the ultimate form of a reward is feeling like you're showing up as the type of person that you want to be, that it's reinforcing your desired identity. But as you mentioned, the problem is it takes a long time for that to be true. Like, the first time you meditate, you don't identify as I'm a meditator and it feels good to do this because that's part of who I am and part of my identity. It might take you a year or 2 or who knows how long before you actually start to adopt that feeling. I mean, I didn't identify as an author until I actually had a published book. Like, even when I was writing it, I didn't feel like I was an author. So that can take a long time. I think the key, though, is that, in my opinion, there are kind of 2 things. One, you want some kind of a reward that is immediate. And I think the speed of it is actually quite important. You need to feel that positive emotional signal right away so that you have a reason to tie that behavior to feeling good, and you have a reason to repeat it again in the future when the same situation arises. So there are a couple different ways you can do this. One very simple way that applies to almost any habit is to use a habit tracker. So I'd like to use my dad as an example here. So both of my parents like to swim, but one of the challenges with swimming is that your body looks exactly the same when you get out of the water as it does when you jumped in. And so you have no evidence that that workout was worth it, right? You have no evidence that this is actually getting you what you want. And so what my dad does is, after each workout, he pulls out a little calendar and he puts an X on that day. And it's a small thing, but that X in the moment is something that matches the frequency of the habit every time he swims. He also gets to put an X down. And it gives him a signal of visual progress. We just mentioned that progress is one of the most motivating feelings for the human mind. You need to have some way to visualize that, some way to see that you're progressing. Because if you can't see the change in your body, or there's no change on the scale yet, you need something else that says, hey, that was the right thing to do. This feels good to show up and do the thing I want to do. So a habit tracker is one very simple one. The other thing, though, and people talk about external rewards all the time. And so, like, oh, I went to the gym, and so I'm going to reward myself by getting an ice cream cone or something. But my little nuance or argument here is I think you want to choose external rewards that align with the internal identity that you're trying to build. So if you reward yourself for going to the gym by getting an ice cream cone, that's kind of like casting votes for two different identities. Like on the one hand, you're casting a vote for being a healthy person. On the other hand, you're casting a vote for eating ice cream or whatever. So instead, you could do something like reward yourself, any week when you don't miss a workout, you reward yourself with a bubble bath at the end of the week. And that's sort of like an external reward that also is a vote for taking care of your body. And so that kind of aligns with that identity that you're trying to build through working out. Or say any month that you hit your target of saving for retirement, some people might say, oh, well, you could reward yourself by buying a leather jacket, but that doesn't really align with the financial saving mentality you're trying to build. So instead, I would say, well, any month that you hit that target, you could reward yourself with, say, a free hour where you get to take a walk in the park, or free time to do whatever you want. Because really what you're trying to get to with retirement is freedom. And so you're kind of aligning with that same internal identity that you're trying to build. But I do think that the faster, so the immediacy part, the faster you can get a positive reward, that's a really powerful thing. And the more that your external rewards can align with the internal identity you're trying to build, that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, we at home use tick charts on the wall to try and get that sort of progress going. So my wife, me, my two kids, we've all got a tick chart on the wall. We've chosen, this is basically what my last book was about, where we've chosen a mind, body, and heart health snack a day. So something for your mental health, something for your physical health, something for your emotional health. They all take under 5 minutes, and my kids do them initially, at least, to get their tick, right? So that was actually the motivator for them to do it. And I think what you said there about the speed at which you get the reward, I think that's really important, because I found that often the kids, sometimes if they would forget to put their tick, and I say, oh, you can do it at the end of the day when you're back from school, you can put your ticks on, you start to lose the connection, right, between behavior and reward. And I wonder for you, James, like I've heard you say in a previous interview that, when you send out your weekly newsletter, within an hour you're starting to get replies and you're getting that feedback. So you've got that loop going. Oh, I've done something. I start to hear and experience how that's impacting people. How did that go for you when you were writing a book, which obviously takes a long time, and you're not getting that immediate reward? Did that make it harder to stay focused and to stay motivated?
Definitely. I think, sort of the topic that we're kind of circling right now is basically like immediate feedback, or having feedback loops in your behavior and how those influence your actions. And so you're right, whether you post a tweet and you kind of start seeing likes trickle in, within the first few minutes, or whether you send out a newsletter, in my case, and you get replies within an hour, those feedback loops are very fast and very motivating, because it feels good to get that, to get those signals of feedback, those signals of progress. And that's enough to get me to show up again the next day and like, let's work on next week's article, or let's work on the next tweet, or whatever. But with writing a book, the feedback cycle, the feedback loop is so long. One of the great challenges of writing a book is you sit down and work on something. It's this huge manuscript, 200 pages, 300 pages, whatever. And it's a total mess. And you work hard for 8 hours, and it's just as much of a mess as when you started. There's nothing, and you have to continue to do that for like 2 years before it actually turns into something and like starts to congeal and clarify itself. And I didn't realize that was going to be such a challenge for me, because Atomic Habits was my first book. But when I was in the middle of it, it was very hard. And I don't need a million people to read my work when I'm working on it, but I do need somebody to give me some feedback and say, hey, you're on the right path. And so eventually the way that I solved that was by hiring an editor to send drafts to and just get a little bit of feedback from them and, iterate on my ideas. And that was really crucial because that first year was very hard for me. I felt like I was kind of lost. I have another point that I want to add to this kind of feedback loop conversation.
Sure.
And it came up when you were mentioning something a minute ago. This is true. It's feedback loops like that are powerful. Immediate feedback is powerful, not only for solidifying good habits, for kind of making us feel motivated and getting these signals of progress, but it also will curtail bad behavior if you have a very immediate consequence or punishment to the behavior. So two of my favorite examples, Danella Meadows, was a great systems thinker and engineer, she had an idea where she said, if we want to reduce pollution, any manufacturing facility that produces waste and lets the wastewater out into the river, they should be required to take up water for their facility downstream, so that the very first place that feels the effects of the pollution is the place that is producing it. Yeah. Another one that I really liked, apparently Boeing, when they were working on their planes and they first made the switch, I think this is in the 1990s, when they first made the switch from a fully manual wing to one that was fully software driven, the engineers who designed the software were required to be on the first test flight. And it's partially that's because they wanted to test some things, but it's such a great alignment of incentives. You better get this right because you're going to be the one who pays the cost. And those are two just beautiful examples of immediate feedback loops, in this case, an immediate consequence. And the faster that consequence or reward is delivered, the more immediately it's associated with a behavior, the more likely it is the behavior is going to change. And this is something in Atomic Habits, I refer to this as the cardinal rule of behavior change, which is behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And it's really the speed that is kind of the key factor there.
If you want to see the recent one-on-one conversation I had with the inspirational Dr. Gabor Mate, it's a great conversation. I really think you're going to enjoy it. You can check it out right there.
But much of physical pathology can be traced to childhood experiences and how we cope with those experiences and what those experiences did